Hello everyone, welcome back to Gustav Coding. In our last video, we got started with Spring Boot, exploring its exciting features and setting up our development environment. If you missed that, be sure to check it out, link in the description below. In this chapter, we are going to take things a step further and dive into the heart of Spring Boot development by creating a basic RESTful API. We will cover request mapping, HTTP methods, and returning data as JSON. By the end of this chapter, you will have a solid understanding of how to build APIs with Spring Boot. So let's get started. So before we begin, let's take a look at this diagram. Now, this is how a typical Spring Boot application backend looks like. We have the client, API layer, business layer, the data access layer, and the database, if any. The client sends a request to the API layer. Then API layer sends it to the business layer. Business layer also sends it to the data access layer, then to the database. For the client to receive a response, the process is reversed, starting from the database to data access layer, to business layer, to API layer, and finally to the client. To create a RESTful API with Spring Boot, we need to start by building our first controller. In Spring Boot, controllers are responsible for handling incoming HTTP requests. That is, the get, post, put, delete, and then returning the appropriate responses. Let's dive into the code. In your Spring Boot project, you can create a new controller class. But before that, let's create a package. So right click on this package name, go to new and click package. And let's give it the name book. So our package will be com.gustafofosu.springboottutorial.book. Now let's create our controller. Right click the book package, go to new and click class. Then we give it the name book controller. Now you can name it whatever you like, but it's always best to relate it to the focus of your project. In our case, the book. In this class, we'll create a simple endpoint that responds with a hello Spring Boot developers message when you access it. So type public string greet, then return, and then the message hello Spring Boot developers, and semicolon. Let's annotate our class with @rest controller, and then our greet method with the @request mapping annotation. Now we use the @rest controller annotation to mark this class as a controller, and the @request mapping annotation specifies the URL path that this endpoint will listen to. Inside the @request mapping annotation, we specify the path hello. So when we access this path, our method will be called. Now that's it. We've just built our first controller. Now let's see it in action. Click on run and wait for the project to load. Now go to our browser. In the browser, you type localhost 8080/hello and press enter. And as you can see, we get our message. Hello, Spring Boot developers. Cool, right? Okay. in the code we just wrote, we created a method in our controller class. But how do we specify which HTTP method it should respond to? You can use various annotations to map different HTTP methods to controller methods. In our code, we used the @request mapping to get our request response. Now let's move the @request mapping annotation to class level. So we move it and put it here. And then we change the path to API/books. Now we want our greet method to respond to get request. So let's use the @get mapping annotation. So on top of our greet method, we type the @get mapping annotation. And we add the path /hello. Now here, we've used the @get mapping to specify that this method responds to get request on the /API/books/hello path. Now, Spring Boot provides similar annotations for other HTTP methods, like the post, the put, and the delete methods. If you want to handle post requests, you can use the @post mapping annotation. If you want to update data by request, you use the @put mapping annotation. And if you want to delete data, you can use the @delete mapping annotation. So by using these annotations, you can easily map controller methods to specific HTTP methods, making your API clean and organized. Now that we have our controller method responding to requests, let's talk about how to return data typically in JSON format to the client. In Spring Boot, returning data as JSON is incredibly easy. You just need to return an object from your controller method, and Spring Boot takes care of the rest. So for instance, you can create a simple Java class representing the data you want to send as JSON. Then, in your controller method, you can return an instance of this class. Spring Boot will automatically serialize its JSON. We will look at that when we get to working with the data, but for now, we will make use of the list interface. So let's change our return type from string to list, and it must return a string. Now let's return list.of, then hello in parentheses, comma, Spring Boot, comma, then developers, then we close it with a semicolon. So Spring Boot will serialize this to JSON. Now let's run the application. Now going back to our browser. Now when we try to access our hello endpoint, we will get an error. Now the reason for the error is because the API path has changed. So we need to change this to localhost 8080/API/books/hello. And then when we press enter, we will get a JSON response with our hello Spring Boot developer message serialized into a JSON format. Now that's how easy it is to return data as JSON in Spring Boot. So in this section, we've learned how to build our first controller, map HTTP methods to controller methods, and return data as JSON. It's a significant step towards building robust APIs with Spring Boot. If you found this information helpful, give us a thumbs up, and if you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them below. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter in this Spring Boot tutorial series, where we'll dive deeper into data interaction with Spring Boot. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.